And so, okay, we welcome everyone to this conference where Professor Klaus Dodds is going to present his book, Border Wars. And I'd also like to tell you that he is a professor of geopolitics in the Royal Holloway University of London and fellow in the Academy of Social Sciences, has published different books, among them Border Wars this year, The Antarctic, and Geopolitics. In this conference, he will mainly be talking about border wars, where he addresses the different types of borders that are nowadays seen in the world and their implications. Now I will leave the floor to Juan Pablo Toro, Executive Director of Athena Lab, who will be introducing this conference, and Professor Dodds. Juan Pablo, the floor is yours. Thank you, Fernanda, and I'd like to welcome everyone who is connected to this new webinar by Athena Lab. We are really happy to have a Professor Klaus Dodds with us, who kindly decided to talk about his new book, which we're actually recommending today, Border Wars, which went through so many borders from the United Kingdom to Chile. And we consider this extremely relevant and relevant to invite Professor Dodds to present his books because this addresses the different types of borders, offers a typology and the dynamics governing these borders. And I believe all of you realize by now that Chile is facing different pressures on its borders. There are traditional pressures. For example, yesterday we were hearing the president of Bolivia, right, Luis Arce, regarding the Day of the Sea in Bolivia, once again trying to claim their pathway to sea, and the government immediately answered them. And we have also seen Argentina's recent ambitions to once again claim an extended continental platform which goes over Chilean territory, and that's another border pressure which we're now facing. And last year we paid lots of attention when there was a foreign fishing fleet next to our economic exclusive zone, mostly China, which is somewhere around the southern Atlantic now. And we have transnational phenomena which are pressuring most borders, such as illegal immigration, especially from the north and our border with Bolivia and also with Peru, and traditional pressures due to drug traffic on those territories. So as you can see, there are many different types of borders, which we have, and many different dynamics, border dynamics, which we are also facing. And in order to better understand those, Professor Dodds is going to be explaining how these are categorized. And also he will be talking about how this may evolve because some borders maybe we are not seeing them adequately. And he will also be talking about those other borders. And let's think about the pandemic, for example, many closed borders, this virus going around the world. So I believe this is one of the most important conferences so far. And without any further ado, and of course, thanking Professor Dodds and all of you, I'd like to give Professor Dodds the floor. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation, and also for organizing the simultaneous translation into Spanish, which I really appreciate. It's a great honor to come and speak with everybody. And what I'd like to do is, all being well, share my screen, because I thought it'd be sort of more interesting to show you some images and to give you a sense of what the book was about. So if this all goes well, I'm going to try and do it now. And then just bear with me a second. And then hopefully that will be okay. How does that look? Great, great. So thank you very much. So again, my thanks again for the very kind introduction and for facilitating this opportunity to come and speak with you this afternoon or this evening, because I'm 3 hours ahead of you in terms of London. So the book came about really as a consequence of thinking about borders and the sort of conflicts they generate for a variety of reasons. So one of the key drivers that sort of informs the book really comes out of an experience I had writing for the Geographical magazine, which is published in London. And every month I was writing a column called Geopolitical Hotspot. And when I look back over the 15 years that I wrote this column, I noticed that actually the majority addressed border conflicts or border disputes in one form or another. And so I've put here two images to make the point that the border came in all shapes and sizes. So for example, on the one hand, I often did focus on the border as a disputed piece of territory. And that might be a dispute over a land border or a border at sea. And that's often the more sort of familiar sense we have of a border, a sort of physical border, somewhere we can kind of locate either in a place or on a map. But of course, the other way that the border can be thought about is the way in which we border our imagination. So the sort of border becomes a sort of a process or a verb, to border or bordering. And so I thought I'd have the image here of the Trump campaign cap, where President Trump argued that he was going to make America great again. And one of the pillars that underpinned this return to a very, very explicit kind of American exceptionalism or supremacy was the idea that the southern border of the United States was vulnerable, was being exploited by a southern neighbor and or migrants from further south who were indifferent to the United States and its need for national or homeland security. So when, of course, President Trump said, or even as a candidate, he said, you know, I'm going to build a beautiful wall, that was also accompanied by a whole series of racist and xenophobic imaginaries or imaginations or mental maps that made it quite clear that Trump saw the South as an undesirable space. And of course, that's not new. There's a long history which is associated with America that is often looked south and thought of the South as threatening or unstable, or certainly a sort of civilizational concern. Whereas when America looked north, it often had a far more benign view. I mean, it's just worth reminding everybody that when 9/11 struck, it was the southern border that was shut down, not the northern one, even though, of course, as we know, Mexico had absolutely nothing to do with that dreadful day in September 2001. Another thing I thought I'd just sort of mention is that Border Wars also comes out of a sort of a catalogue of work that I've done over the years. And many, many years ago, I spent actually some time in both Argentina and Chile. And in particular was very, very interested in how the three countries, Argentina, Chile, and the United Kingdom, had both shared preoccupations with spaces like the Antarctic, but also in the case of Argentina and the United Kingdom had a very long-standing and ongoing dispute over, for example, the Malvinas Islands. Whereas, of course, Argentina and Chile, as this audience knows only too well, have had a whole series of historic and ongoing conflicts and tensions around their shared border, both on land and on water. So that was one thing I think undeniably made me very sensitive to the way in which nationalism gets territorialized or bordered. And we can see that, of course, not just through our maps, but also perhaps through our public memorials or through our social rituals. So one of the things that was mentioned earlier in the introduction is that, you know, we know every day, I think it's on the 23rd of March, yesterday, that Bolivia will actually have a national day where it mourns the loss of access to the sea. And that becomes a really important part of the making of a Bolivian citizen. In other words, that no Bolivian citizen will grow up not understanding that this is a sort of outstanding territorial violation that the Bolivian state in some form or other must reverse. Likewise, you could say the same in Argentina. It'd be very unlikely that any Argentine citizen growing up in the Republic would be unaware of the loss of the Malvinas and the outstanding territorial conflicts that Argentina has with the United Kingdom over, for example, South Georgia and South Sandwich. And certainly I recall in Argentina, in the 1990s, there was never any shortage of maps that were eager to remind the reader that there was, of course, an Argentine Antarctic territory, just as there is a Chilean Antarctic territory. Another area that I was interested in the way that borders work is through popular culture. So how do borders get represented and reported and dramatized? So one of my favorite films is a film called Frozen River that was released in 2008 and is a sort of fictional depiction of the US-Canadian border and the role that ice plays in freezing over the St. Lawrence and enabling, for example, people smugglers to go back and forth over the ice-covered river. And then finally, more of my recent work has been in the Arctic, where there's been no shortage of interest in trying to border and reborder the seabed of the Arctic Ocean. So what you see there is a sort of rather splendid stamp that was released after 2007, when the Russian flag was deposited on the bottom of the Central Arctic Ocean. So it was a kind of spectacular act that was captured via the photograph, via an image, which then of course went viral and led to international media sort of stating to their readers and listeners that there was a new scramble for the Arctic as countries were trying to map, survey, and claim it. Now, of course, because I'm speaking to an overwhelming audience located in Chile, I thought it'd be also just important just to pick up what was said at the introduction, is that Chile, of course, has a whole series of border concerns, some historic, some ongoing. And as anyone who's been to the country would recognize, as I have quite a few times, those borders make themselves felt in different sorts of ways. And of course, they've changed. And so one of the things that Border Wars tries to do is to actually look at how borders have functioned historically as sources of both security and insecurity, but also acknowledged, of course, that our sense of borders in terms of what they can do, can't do, changes as well. So for example, Chile, of course, northern border has faced really quite novel pressures through migrants, mainly hailing from Venezuela, in very, very large numbers. Chile, of course, has had historic and ongoing disputes with Peru and Argentina over certain borders, north and south. And of course, Chile, because of its tricontinental nature in terms of having the Galapagos Islands, mainland Chile, Chilean Antarctic territory, those border spaces are complicated. And so a lot of the concern over borders might be felt, for example, in glaciated regions, high altitude regions. They might make themselves felt over desert, but of course it's the maritime dimension as well that's been a huge preoccupation for the country because of the nature of the physical geography of the Earth. Chile's exclusive economic zone is really very, very substantial. And of course, there's been a great deal of concern over the role of distant watering fishing fleets, particularly the Chinese. So I think one of the things that Border Wars, I hope, does is set up a kind of framework, which then you can begin to think how that might apply in varying degrees to whatever particular country or region you care to focus on. And then the other thing I think it's worth just noting, and this has really informed the spirit of the book, is that there's been a considerable academic literature on border studies. Some of that has been described as critical border studies, but I think the key thing to take away from border studies, as I see it, is that the border is not a fixed line. It's not something that is just defined at the edge of a nation state or just, for example, depicted on a map. The border is movable, it's flexible, it is, as I put here, institutionally dynamic. In other words, for example, who or what gets to border or who or what finds themselves bordered is not static. And the border moves because depending on what you are, the border, of course, can travel considerably inside a nation state. And you can trace that, for example, through how we monitor the movement of objects and peoples. But you can also see that, I think, unquestionably during the pandemic, where certainly in my country, we were being asked to load up on our mobile phones track and trace technologies that sort of enabled, if you like, the nation state to gain ever more information about where we were and what kind of things we were doing. So I think it's really, really important that the border is seen as very, very diffuse and multifaceted. It's not just one thing or another, and it's certainly not static. And that also is, I think, matters again, because this is the final point I want to make about critical border studies, is actually if we move away from the idea that the border is fixed and it's just straightforwardly defined along the edge of a nation state, then I think we also begin to think about how our attitudes and our practices towards borders also evolve and take on a different kind of complexion. And we can see this over the last 30 years, for example. So the images at the bottom of this slide, well, the one on the right-hand side, you'll probably recognize straight away, of course, from November 1989. And there was huge optimism in those early years post-1989, at least in Europe and North America, that borders were going to matter less. The Berlin Wall stood for something broader, which was that Western states with their liberal democratic values and their market capitalism were going to triumph. And as a consequence, the world was going to brace a kind of open-ended globalization that would welcome the demise of the border. What we've seen, of course, is that a whole group of countries took a rather different view about the wisdom, let alone attractiveness of open borders. But of course, post-2001, the United States also began to took a sort of radically different view of the border and invested hugely in trying to create a great deal more surveillance around the border, and actually was far more sort of reticent about celebrating open borders per se. And more recently, in the last 10 years, we've seen the rise of the so-called smart border. So trying to use digital technologies, big data, to process and to track and to trace the movement of things and people in particular. So borders also, I think, as well as mutating and changing and picking up different sorts of characteristics and scope, can also reveal to us, I think, important questions about the state of the international order and maybe, of course, the regional geopolitical order. And we can often have, I think, depending on where we look and what part of the world we focus on, we can have very different conversations about the border. So one of the things, of course, the Russians learned about Crimea in 2014 is that you can annex a disputed territory, and actually the reaction of the world will be rather muted in the form of sanctions, but they won't try and necessarily remove you from that particular space. Contrast that, of course, with the Persian Gulf conflict, where great effort was made to extract Iraq from the occupied territory of Kuwait. So when we look at world politics, what often reveals itself is that the border ends up offering clues as to the balance of power or the distribution of power and the hierarchy of states. Some states, in essence, can be persuaded, bullied, attacked into not doing certain things around their borders, whilst others have a very different, if you like, relationship with borders and bordering. And of course, I wanted to make the point about border wars, plural, to really stress that when I used the term wars in this book, I wasn't just thinking of wars in the sense of actual armed conflict. In other words, armies, militaries confronting one another. I was also thinking about wars as in terms of a more kind of symbolic set of conflicts, or conflicts that, although may not involve state-to-state confrontation, nonetheless have very, very real world consequences for those who find themselves on the wrong end of borders. So some of that work, I think, tries to connect up with a broader academic literature that goes beyond critical border studies and tries to pick up on things like mobility justice. So who is allowed to cross a border or not cross a border? Also to try and pick up on, for example, citizenship in terms of for those who are undocumented, or for those, for example, who are waiting to become citizen, the border sort of follows them around. They never quite know when they're going to be required, for example, to show their identity papers. So I was interested in the kind of the violence that I think can often make itself felt through bureaucracy and the sorts of delays or the costs that it imposes upon people when they cross a border. It might also be, as I go on to explain in Border Wars, where physical geography doesn't do the job that it was once thought to do, which was to act as natural borders. So when, for example, climate change accelerates physical geographical breakdown, then what does that do to our bordering practices? So whether it's glaciers retreating, avalanches destroying watersheds or ridges, or whether it's, for example, low-lying territories being flooded and overwhelmed, then we often see already actually evidence of countries going into conflict with one another because the physical geography just doesn't stay still. So part of, I think, of the sort of more recent history of bordering alongside the nation state has been absolutely grounded, so to say, in the assumption that the physical environment was relatively stable. Borders also increasingly have proven themselves to be very adept in creating a whole series of no man's lands or grey zones or even death zones, where actually the ambiguity of the border enables states and other parties to, for example, trap people or things, or to divert or to deflect. So one of the things that I think has often been commented about the US-Mexican border is that as border infrastructure thickened and got more severe in and around San Diego, and then spread across the bottom of California, if you will, and Arizona, so migrants were being deflected or being pushed, if you will, to make ever more riskier crossings of desert and mountain, often with disastrous consequences. And then, of course, the other thing I wanted to sort of point out towards the end as well is that these borders, these border technologies, these practices often stimulate counter reactions, sort of resistances, protests, and sorts of attempts to undo the border as well. Some of that may be quite spectacular, some of that may be part of everyday life where people work hard to try and marginalize the border or bordering. So I think that point about the ways in which borders can move and in different ways for me was quite important. In other words, so not seeing the border and the kind of the infrastructures that enable the border as always overwhelming, or that's it, or as if to make the point that state power often does have limits and will indeed generate counter reactions where people work quite hard actually to try and push back against that border violence. So in the book, I tried to develop a typology, sort of three types of so-called border wars. So one is the one you're probably most familiar with, is contested borders. The second is around grey borders, as I call them. And the third is around new borders of various descriptions. So let me just kind of quickly take you through that sort of typology that I work through in the book. So as I say, the first one was looking at the sort of contested borders. So how do the edges of the nation state, how do borders that won't stand still, and how do borders that get inundated provoke conflict and tension. So one of the kind of the things that probably exemplifies this best, perhaps, is somewhere like the South China Sea, where the Chinese authorities in particular, who argue that the South China Seas are Chinese historic waters, have very, very deliberately tried to re-engineer the physical geographies of the ocean to enable the country to establish a whole series of artificial islands where they can then settle and colonize and use that to cement their sort of sovereign control. And that's created a whole series of tensions, of course, some of which has been internationally challenged, including by the Philippines. But it's a really good reminder that borders, for all the talk about borders being unmade because of climate change, they can also be remade or re-engineered, where in this case, international law provides a kind of proxy to try and promote and engender sovereign authority. Moving borders, particularly, of course, pertinent to mountainous countries, whether it's Chile, whether it's Switzerland, or India and China. The mountain has always proven to be a considerable adversary to those who want to establish borders. So, you know, I only have to mention the Sichuan Glacier, where India and Pakistan continue to contest to make that point. And more recently, of course, India and China have found themselves in a series of ugly skirmishes in the Himalayas. And a great deal of that has been because of the ambiguity of the border. Where exactly was the border drawn? And in some cases, of course, even if it was drawn or established relatively clearly, one party has proven quite adept at ignoring it on particular occasions. Some of this conflict, of course, can be quite banal. It can be quite everyday. It can be mundane. So we're not always interested in just when it's very spectacular. But one of the points I try to make in border wars as well, that even when there is no conflict or tension, countries often find ways of reminding their citizens about why these disputed borders matter to the future of the nation state. So I just use a quick example here on the left-hand side involving the disputed territory from Venezuela's point of view in terms of 2/3 of Guyana, depending on you know, where the border should be drawn. And one of the things that I said in the book was, you know, my mother came back from a trip to Venezuela in the 1990s, brought me a tea towel, you know, and with a map of Venezuela. And initially I thought, why she bought me this tea towel? I really don't need a tea towel. But then she said, look more closely at the map. What do you see? And I said, of course I could see that Venezuela, the depiction of Venezuela included 2/3 of Guyana. So there was a sort of a nice illustration of how these border tensions get incorporated into national cultures. And again, depending on where we look, there's evidence plenty of how moving borders, shifting borders, uncertain borders gets worked into those national cultures and becomes an important part in sort of reminding citizens that borders can never be taken for granted. In some cases, of course, as I mentioned earlier, if sea levels continue to rise, then there is a real danger that things just disappear, with all the concerns that might follow in terms of what are the implications when, for example, a national population can no longer live on a particular island or coastal region. And that's been a real concern, for example, in the Indian and Pacific Ocean, with countries like the Maldives raising this very issue that they might be underwater in the coming decades of the current century. No man's lands were my sort of second major example of where border conflict can flourish in different kinds of territorial uncertainties. And they can stretch, of course, beyond those particular territorial zones, but they can also be, of course, highly dynamic and moving. So one of the things we discovered with the Syrian refugee crisis in 2014, 2015, particularly affecting Europe, is that a whole series of so-called no man's lands began to emerge, where one country didn't want to take responsibility for refugees, was trying to push it towards various kinds of spaces, or even within a country, the state authorities were pulling back and actually not looking to actively police or intervening, and hoping those refugees simply went somewhere else. And we saw borders being opened and closed depending on the strategies being adopted by countries concerned. No man's lands and grey zones can also, of course, take hold in the sea, both at the surface and at the seabed. So, for example, the Eastern Mediterranean is a real hotbed for competing territorial and border mental maps and imaginaries, where Cyprus, Turkey, Greece argue with one another about where those lines on the map should be drawn, and then, of course, use activity like gas drilling to try and cement their presence in particular parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, and are busy building alliances with other coastal states like Israel, Egypt, and Libya. So it's a really messy, highly dynamic, and I think dangerous situation. The third type of example I try to pull out in the book is what I call new borders, and there's a number of different ways in which I think they're making themselves manifest. One is, I think, is around the whole idea of the smart border. This is where states invest more and more energy and effort in the collection and analysis of data, or, for example, they create ever more elaborate surveillance infrastructures, both at the physical edge of the nation state, but increasingly, of course, cutting across the nation state. So where the domestic and the exterior become, in some senses, harder and harder to distinguish, because border or immigration authorities that might have previously worked at the border, that might have been a land border, it might have been at airports, are given ever greater authority to migrate around the country in search of the undocumented, the illegal, or whatever it might be. So these borders can start to profuse and diffuse everywhere. There's no longer a sense of where borders may begin and end. And as we all knew, at least before the pandemic, that if you wanted to travel anywhere, like many of us, I'm sure, you had to submit your advanced passenger information before, even getting, for example, your online boarding card, or, before you could even do check-in. And so we're seeing more and more of that, and often airports are at the epicenter of smart borders, but not exclusively so. So I look really at smart borders as a different kind of border conflict, where we might have conflicts over what happens to that data. What does it do, for example, to privacy? Can the smart border be hacked? And all the sort of ramifications that might follow from that. We know, for example, in Europe, to give you an example closer to my home, there's been a huge amount of effort invested by the European Union in smart border technologies. And one of the things they've been trying to do is work very closely with third parties such as Morocco and Niger to try and stop them, or incentivize them, I should say, to help stop illegal migrants. And part of that has been about entering into data sharing agreements about the movement or otherwise of people. And then we can see organizations like Sea-Watch that in some ways are trying to circumvent those bordering strategies by actively seeking to rescue and to work through a humanitarian mission where the focus is on stopping people making those precarious journeys across the Mediterranean. This is not unique to the European Union. The United States has also been working exceptionally hard alongside smart border technologies to extend its border infrastructure increasingly all over Central America, again, to try and intervene before migrants, for example, set off. So there's been a huge amount of effort being made to try and, in a sense, extend the border or to export the border somewhere else. I also make the point that, of course, bordering practices are also ongoing. So whether we look at the deep oceans, whether we look at space, or whether we look at Antarctica, we're seeing increasingly the so-called global commons, some of which is in space, some of which is on Earth, as I think attracting ever more interest when it comes to borders and bordering. And a lot of that simply is about trying to colonize and privatize these spaces, often for resource and strategic advantage. Some of the space things I consider are clearly more conjectural, more futuristic, but I think a lot of the activity we see in the Antarctic and the Arctic is driven by a desire to reborder these particular spaces. And then finally, I thought I'd just mention something about viral borders, because you know, no country has been untouched by this pandemic over the last year. And what we've seen, certainly in the United Kingdom, and what we've seen in other parts of the world, including Chile, of course, is that borders have returned with an absolute vengeance in the ways in which the border at the edge of the state has been hardened in so many places, but also the border has also been used in remarkable ways to effectively lock national populations down, or to divide up countries in the United Kingdom's case through a tier-based system where, you know, you could either be tier 1 all the way up to tier 4 or 5. So we're seeing the border come back in a spectacular way. But what I'd also caution and say, the border never really went away. I think this is just really a more obvious manifestation. So let me end on that note and just simply say there's an awful lot more the book tries to cover as well, and that's a whistle-stop tour of it. But it just gives you a sense, I hope, of some of the questions I was trying to tackle. So I'll end on that note. Thank you very much again for the kind invitation to speak to you.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Dodds, for this brilliant presentation. To be honest, it has been really interesting. And before we move on to the questions from the audience, which are really good, as always, I'd like to make a clarification for our Ecuadorian friend that the Galapagos right and the Ecuadorian sovereignty, because when we're talking about the Pacific, the Galapagos Islands were mentioned, so evidently, I believe he was talking about the Rapa Nui, right, and the other island in the Pacific. But I'm being asked to make that clarification, okay? And I wanted to begin with a question, okay? Since I have the chance, I'd like to begin with a question of mine, okay? At the end of the day, you're talking about these viral borders, and to be honest, we have seen some border closings that were unthinkable before, right? People would be like, okay, how do you even think about closing borders? And some really strict closures, both at the land level and also at the port and airport level. And while the pandemic, right, keeps going, we hope that it may pass one day. Do you think these strict border controls are here to stay? Or after the pandemic, are these going to be phased out and we are going to go back to business as usual?
Thank you very much for that question. And can I also just apologize again for saying the Galapagos when I meant, sorry, Rapa Nui. I was thinking of various islands, and I'm sorry, the wrong island came into my mind. So my apologies. So put that to one side. I think what I think is really interesting is that, and the 9/11 and the war on terror, I think, demonstrated this to us after 2001, is that once states take more power for themselves, particularly extraordinary powers, they are often very, very reluctant to give those powers back, even when a situation changes. And we saw that with Homeland Security and the kind of the color-coded warnings. You know, the United States was a really good example of this. It never went below yellow. So the blue and the green of the Homeland Security system was rarely, if ever, used. And my sense would be, is these extraordinary powers that so many states have taken for themselves, I think are unlikely to disappear anytime soon, not least because epidemiologists and public health experts continue to warn that we should expect more pandemics in the coming decade, not less. So I think I'm very skeptical about that. The thing that I've noticed, and I'm sure you've noticed it in Chile as well, is that if you're not careful, the hardening of borders for public health reasons can very quickly be used as an excuse to harden the border against refugees, asylum seekers, and others who might have genuine reasons for wanting to cross the border. At the same time, you also place an extraordinary burden on many people who simply want to cross a border, not to go for a summer holiday, but just simply see their families who live in other parts of the world. So the cost of that bordering is really very, very multifaceted.
Perfecto. Procedo a las preguntas.
Perfect. Okay, I will proceed to the upcoming questions. Okay, Ivan Peter is saying, okay, thank you, really interesting. And I'd like to know your opinion on Gibraltar. Do you think Gibraltar is an open wound in this European integration? Is it a gray area? Is it a disputed area? What do you think?
So I think Gibraltar is a really, really good example of a sort of a gray zone. So on the one hand, you know, if you were speaking to the United Kingdom government and the government of Gibraltar, they would say that they are absolutely confident that Gibraltar is an overseas territory of the United Kingdom. And yet, if you look at the history of Gibraltar, its relationship with Spain has been absolutely integral to the current and will indeed be the future health of Gibraltar. So a lot of that cross-border movement was absolutely essential, not just about people coming across the border just to work, for example, but also, of course, Spain was essential for those services, for example, like water and communications. And that's not to even mention things like cross-border smuggling that have been a huge part of the Spanish-Gibraltarian relationship. Brexit, of course, has made this a great deal more complicated. And as I'm sure everybody knows, the people of Gibraltar were the most supportive of continued European Union membership. For the United Kingdom, to put it simply, Brexit makes our position more difficult, not only over Gibraltar, but of course over the Malvinas as well. We no longer have the protection of the European Union. And that's, I think that's actually a big loss when it comes to these two outstanding, ongoing territorial conflicts. So I think the United Kingdom will have to work really, really hard with Spain to try and have a sort of a cordial relationship, but we could also see further pressure being placed on the United Kingdom over the sovereignty of Gibraltar.
Gracias. Alexis
Thank
Carrasco.
you. And Alexis Carrasco is asking if is your last book, right, Border Wars, going to be translated into Spanish?
At the moment, Border Wars is being translated into Japanese and Korean, but I would love it to be translated in Spanish. I think it's just a question of finding a publisher who will translate it. I should say my geopolitics very short introduction is about to be published in Spanish this year. So I'm hoping that a Spanish version of Border Wars will be coming soon.
Lo esperamos nosotros también.
We will also be waiting for that. Alberto Rojas is asking, okay, beyond geographic and political borders, can we talk about cyberspace borders and how can these be protected?
That's a really good question. So one of the things that I do talk a little bit about in the book under the smart border is when, for example, the digital border is violated or where digital sovereignty is undermined. So one of the best examples would be 2007 in Estonia, where it is strongly suspected Russian-backed hackers attacked, in a cyber sense, the Estonian infrastructure. And it was really a devastating cyber attack. And it led to Estonia investing ever more heavily in digital security. And actually, Estonia has become probably a world leader in digital security. So we absolutely should talk about borders as being digital as well. And the way in which, for example, data systems can be violated or compromised, or where, for example, states may put themselves in danger because they invite third parties to become involved in infrastructure investment and planning. So just think, for example, I mean, I was reading just yesterday about Chile's increasingly close relationship with China. So one thing I would look at is how involved has China become in your public infrastructure, and whether you will be concerned over time, if that investment portfolio develops, that there might be dangers to your national security through the digital.
Perfecto. El profesor
Perfect. Professor Alfredo Reren says, okay, following your argument that borders are not fixed, are not necessarily fixed, even territorially speaking, what is the impact of re-emerging maritime power, right, and disputing maritime borders for countries like Chile and its natural security, right? And what do you think should be our security concerns? And actually, he is quoting Ivan Luard. I presume a renowned, a known author. He had a book called The Frontiers, Conflict and Peace.
I think the problem for Chile is that because of your geographical size, and because of these offshore islands as well, Rapa Nui just being one of several notable ones in the Pacific Ocean, you have these extraordinary geographical regions that, when you think about exclusive economic zones, it's extending to 200 nautical miles, but then also think about, for example, the outer continental shelf, in other words, the extended seabed. So for a country like Chile, like Argentina, for example, because of that geographical position, you have these very, very large maritime areas. International maritime law says you have territorial seas, you have exclusive economic zones, and so on. But of course, the challenge that everyone's finding, and the Chinese distant water fishing fleets really illustrate this, is how do you prevent illegal fishing? How do you prevent resource theft, or countries doing things, third parties doing things that you don't want them to do because you don't have the maritime surveillance and the capability to patrol these vast, vast areas? And so you can do certain things like remote sensing, using satellite data, for example, but often then it's too late. And if, for example, a Chinese fishing fleet has fished illegally, it's quite another thing to actually apprehend that fleet and to try and seek some kind of justice on the basis of those illegal activities. We saw that, by the way, it's even worse in the Antarctic, where sovereignty is clearly disputed beyond, of course, the claimant states like Argentina and Chile, who think they have a sort of territory, ditto with the United Kingdom. But we saw with, for example, Russia, where it was engaging in fishing where it shouldn't have been in the Southern Ocean. Other parties were reluctant to act against Russia because they didn't want Russia, for example, to leave the Antarctic Treaty System. So as the Philippines found as well, you can have legal rights, but in practice, when you're dealing often with great powers, those legal rights can at times feel very difficult to enforce. So I think it is quite a challenge for countries that appear to be blessed on the one hand, but then in practice, actually protecting your border is really hard work and expensive.
Alejandra Pérez
Alejandra Perez is thanking you for your conference, and she's asking about an investigation research led by the British Antarctic Survey for researching the accelerated melting of the Thwaites Glacier in Western Antarctic. And if this melting, right, of this Thwaites Glacier, is it a warning of how borders are changing in the Antarctic, for example?
Yes, I think that's a really good question. So this is a very interesting investigation involving the British and the Americans in particular, and it's focusing on a part of the Antarctic that is very remote, even more inaccessible than much of Antarctica. Interestingly, also, it's in the so-called unclaimed sector of Antarctica, so that so-called Pacific Ocean sector that no one formally claims. What we're discovering is that Antarctica's ice is really, really vulnerable to climate change, but not as often people think. It's about, for example, air temperature. What we're learning increasingly is that as the water warms, as it is in the Southern Ocean, it literally attacks and undermines the bottom of these ice sheets and these glaciers. And so it creates instability. And the real worry we have, particularly in Western Antarctica, which includes the peninsula, is it's warming rapidly and it's becoming more and more unstable. So I think we can talk about these borders, not only political borders, but also physical borders. When ice, for example, stops being ice and turns into water. And that is increasingly a concern in Antarctica and of course Greenland. And then that has knock-on consequences in terms of rising sea levels, which then we come back to the Maldives and they worry that they're just going to be underwater later on this century. So these border changes then have these sort of knock-on consequences all over the world.
Marcelo pregunta, ¿qué puede hacer la
Marcelo
comunidad?
is asking, okay, what can the international community do to maybe mediate or address the border disputes, whether between physical borders or, because you were talking about Crimea, right, where the international community does not recognize this annexation, but I mean the annexation remains until today. So what can the international community do? Does it have any options, or all we can do is get used to it?
So in Crimea, the answer is we can't do anything about Russia occupying Crimea. So what the West decided was we'll impose sanctions on Russia and we'll punish Russia financially and economically. What that achieved, of course, was to push Russia ever closer towards China. And so the story of the Arctic is Russia and China becoming ever more closely involved with one another in gas extraction and also shipping, transport, because Russia couldn't look to Europe and North America for markets and financial and other kinds of expert support. If you think about Argentina and Chile in your sort of dispute over the Beagle Channel, you know, you were able to turn to the then Pope, famously, the Vatican, and actually, you know, there was a sort of an important element of Vatican diplomacy that led to the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, I think in 1984 or something like that anyway. So there may be very, very particular geographical, cultural, political examples where we find mediation and diplomacy can make a real difference. But there are other areas when you know, we can think about examples, can't we, where one party is so greatly superior in some sense to another party that it is unlikely to be resolved in a way that the weaker party will be very happy about, Israel-Palestine, or we'll have such ridiculous border conflicts like the one involving India and Pakistan over the Sichuan glacier, where nobody is in a sense going to take ownership of that glacier. And that glacier anyway will continue to change over time. And both countries have found it's been exceptionally difficult to resolve a conflict when you're 18 or 20,000 feet above sea level.
Te quería hacer una pregunta.
I wanted to ask a question. Since you're aware of the situation in our region, okay, Argentina, Chile, the United Kingdom, how do you see these new Argentinian ambitions on this continental platform, and which is reflected in these new maps, which are official, they are already being disseminated? Are you just as concerned in the United Kingdom, or do you see this as a script which you already know about claiming sovereignty on paper, but practically the status quo remains? What do you think?
I think, to be perfectly honest, in terms of the way in which the United Kingdom would tend to think of Argentina, would be that none of this would be terribly surprising. I mean, Argentina for decades has used maps and cartography in particular as a way of advertising and promoting its territorial claims. I think the other thing that makes the United Kingdom fairly relaxed about some of those Argentine mapping activities, well, there's two things. Number one, crucially, the United Kingdom and Chile, by and large, have had a very good relationship with one another. And you know, we in the United Kingdom remember only too well 1982. You know, we may have had a conflict with Argentina, but we were very, very fortunate to have a benign relationship with Chile. And our two countries have had a huge amount of naval cooperation, military cooperation, past and present. So that's one thing, and that does make a huge difference in the United Kingdom. I think the second thing is that those Argentine maps, particularly the ones that show a great deal of continental shelf ambition, particularly in the Antarctic, are just not recognized by anybody. And so, for example, when the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, the UN body that has to help try to make sense of those outer continental shelf claims, was quite clear. It was not going to consider those Argentine claims. So to a certain extent, I think we take the view that Argentina can produce any map that it likes, but there are certain fundamentals from the United Kingdom's point of view that aren't going to change. And that would include, I think, our relationship with the Falkland Islands, the Malvinas. You know, that's just not going to change.
Oh, correct. Okay, last question, okay, by Edmundo Villarroel. He's asking, okay, he's asking about border control, right? Territory control in any dimension, okay? How associated should this be to, right, governmental capabilities to regarding this territorial control and how they should answer about this, because he's talking about accountability and responsibility. How, I mean, must the governments and states be able to control this territory? Can citizens demand governments to control these borders?
Well, I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Because, for example, when we think about the pandemic and what we might call pandemic or viral borders, there are lots of citizens that want their government to actively control borders. And what we found in the United Kingdom is that for all the people who may not like lockdown and territorial controls inside the country, there are lots of other people who think lockdown and territorial controls need to exist and would want them to remain in place longer than the UK government. So one of the interesting things I think the pandemic has revealed, and it may be the same in Chile as well, is that public opinion is actually quite split about borders. And where in the United Kingdom we also have a strong number of people who are very, very worried and hostile towards migrants, whether legal or illegal or undocumented, then actually that public health border or bordering has also been seen as quite useful in terms of helping to stop the unwanted flow of some people, mainly, of course, migrants from the Middle East North Africa and elsewhere. So I think what we're kind of having in the United Kingdom is a conversation which is about what are the limits of the nation state in terms of those exceptional powers, and how do we secure accountability when, for example, we're always being told we're in the middle of an emergency or where everything is exceptional. So the thing that I worry about personally is, when are we allowed to say that the exceptional no longer exists and we need to reclaim the normal and be very clear what we think the normal is in terms of liberal democratic norms? Because actually what we've seen is, I would describe as a kind of pandemic authoritarianism, where governments and quite large numbers of citizens are asking for more restrictions rather than less, more bordering rather than less. So I think it's been really interesting to see in the United Kingdom that actually this enthusiasm for bordering is quite widespread.
Perfecto. Entonces, con
Perfect. Okay, so with that last question, then we have come to the end of your interesting presentation. We are slightly behind on time, since we said we are going to be finished at 4:30. We have good news though, because we know one of your books is going to be translated into Spanish. We will be waiting. I mean, we already have some people interested in your new book. So hopefully we can convince a publisher so it can be translated into Spanish. And then we will be in touch. This is going to be recorded for anyone who may want to rewatch it maybe. This has been really interesting. And once again, thank you so much for helping our understanding of borders and their dynamics. As I was saying, Chile has so many different borders, and there are so many different dynamics that are really different. And now we're going to have a better understanding and appreciation. And to everyone who was here today, thank you so much for joining us to hear Professor Dodds and sending your questions as well. We recommend you read Professor Dodd's book. It's going to be really interesting, and you're also invited, because tomorrow at 9:50 Chile time, we are going to be with John Griffiths and be participating in a panel of the Colombian War Academy about challenges of hemisphere level safety in Latin America. And this will also be streamed via Facebook Live. And then you will be able to participate in this seminar as well, where we are going to be addressing other important issues. So Professor Dodds, thank you so much once again. Have a really good day. Take care. We are in a pandemic, you know, it's still ongoing, and we'll be in touch. Okay, and thank you so much to everyone for being here.
Thank you again. Bye.
Adiós. Chao, gracias.